is associated with the school. His wife's a realtor here in this part of the world, and it's good to have them with us. As I've said before, our class grows after 10-15. Some people taking their kids to Sabbath school, which is a good thing. I'm glad we have a lot of kids here. When I was younger, I used to be so aggravated about hearing babies crying and disrupting things. Now, if I don't hear babies crying, I probably am at a church that's not going anywhere. So I'm very, very happy about that. So, with that said, am I missing anything? Any news? Marge is not here. Anyway, I guess not. Would you mind standing and having our prayer for us?
Loving Father, we thank you again for a beautiful Sabbath morning. We thank you for the opportunity again that we have to be here as a group to study the Bible together. And this morning, as we are going through these things, help each one of us to consider in our own lives how we have reacted to various situations, and help us above all to go from here a little clearer understanding of the Bible, why you have these stories there, and what it can do to help us in our lives. Bless our families today, bless each one here, those who are not here, bless us in Jesus' name.
I'd also like to say, for those that are new, 10 years ago when we started this class, we were basically very small. Doug got involved. Doug was a teacher here at Southern, and the class began to explode. We had to move from where we were. And before COVID, even this room was getting almost too full at times. Doug is a master teacher, and he's right now at Walla Walla Student Life. And I can assure you, with COVID and other issues that are going on in our world, he stays quite busy, and I'm grateful he writes our lessons and has agreed to teach via Zoom. So Douglas, take over.
Okay. And if the audio or the video goes bad, please let me know, and I may have to switch to my phone, but right now it's working from my computer. It's good to be with you, really good to be with you. And we are in 2 Samuel chapter 12 today, and we are finishing the story of David and Bathsheba. This is probably one of the most familiar stories in David's life and possibly even the Bible. People who know very little about the Bible have probably heard something about David and Bathsheba. And we spent some considerable time on it. John got us started with it. And John, I appreciated your taking us into the path of character. And what was David's character? What is our character? And Ken, you took us a little bit farther into the story. And I really appreciated, among other things, the focus that you gave us on grounding, what grounds us, and what would have grounded David. And today we are looking at the last part of this story, and it's a tragic part. I don't know many parts of the story that are not tragic, but it's a very tragic part of the story where this little baby dies, this baby that is the result of this affair. And that has been a troubling part of the story to many people, because they said, wait a minute, this little baby was just collateral damage. Why does this baby die? So we are going to look at that part of the story today. And the theme, if you had a chance to look at the lesson that I got done quite late in the week, but if you had a chance to look at it, really the theme that we're looking at is this idea of grace and accountability. Grace and accountability. Or another way that you could think about that is forgiveness and consequences. If we're forgiven, then are there any consequences? Or if we extend grace to somebody, then do we hold them accountable? And I'd like to just give you a glimpse into my world for a minute. And I'm going to give you a handful of examples, and I've tried to change enough about these examples so that they are appropriate to share. The Adventist world is a pretty small place, and there's, I guess, some possibility that you might even know some of the people involved in these stories. But this is a little glimpse into my world that Ken mentioned that I am now an administrator rather than a professor. And it is true that the area that I handle is involved with this question a lot: grace and accountability, forgiveness and consequences. And because I work with the area of student life, that means that I work with the area of student conduct and discipline. And while I never make these decisions just by myself, I oftentimes get impassioned letters or phone calls with people trying to influence me as a part of that decision-making process. I remember a phone call I got actually a couple of years ago from a very, very angry person who had heard about a particular situation involving 3 or 4 students on campus, and they had indeed done something wrong. She didn't happen to know anything about these students, but the offense that they were responsible for was particularly offensive to her. And so somewhere in her phone call, she burst out with quite a bit of anger. I had to take the phone away from my ear just a little bit. She said, "I think that these students should have the strictest possible consequence, starting with expulsion." And I didn't say it, but I thought it. I thought, well, starting with expulsion and ending with execution? Because once we expel a student, that's kind of the extent of what we can do. And so, that's one type of phone call I get. On the other hand, and that's obviously somebody who wants to make sure that we hold students accountable. So that's the accountability side. Then I have the other side, and I think of impassioned letters, sometimes long letters I get, detailing every time this person gave special music and helped with Pathfinders and helped a little old lady across the street and did all these beautiful things. And that because of this, that whatever they were found responsible for in their bad behavior on campus should be completely overlooked, because obviously this is a good kid. And so that's clear the other end of the spectrum. And somebody, I get letters from youth pastors and former teachers and parents and friends and neighbors pleading with me to show grace and reminding me that Jesus showed grace, and that if I'm a Jesus-like person, I'm going to show grace. And you see how it goes. So you have the people screaming for justice and screaming for consequences on the one hand, and people pleading for mercy and grace on the other. And this is my world, part of it, not the whole of it, but this is part of my world on a day-to-day basis where I live and work. And Keith, I see you online here. And as a professor, I'm sure that you have dealt with cheating a few times. And let me just tell a couple quick stories, starting with a cheating story. So you have this pre-med student who is scared that their GPA is going to drop. And they find, through some cleverness, the answer keys for all their biochem tests, or organic chem, take your pick. And that comes to light. Okay, what do you show? Grace or accountability? How do you blend the two? Okay, Keith, I see you smiling. You've had to answer these questions before. And you don't always do it exactly the same. You think about it. You look at the situation. You look at the student. Let me give you a couple of others. A student, young male student, offering to help a young female student move into a new apartment. And they're not boyfriend and girlfriend, but they are friends. They've known each other for a while. And several months after the move-in, she discovers, cleverly hidden in her bookshelf, is a little camera focused on the part of the room where she is most likely to get dressed and undressed. Very likely placed there by the kind friend who helped her move in. And that comes to student life, and we say, okay, what's the gracious thing to do with both of these students? What is the responsible thing How do you do grace and accountability? Sometimes you just want to get so mad at somebody, you want to throw the book at them. And yet you also want to show grace. A couple of other stories. A student has a car, real nice souped up car, big oversized tires on it. And those tires get stolen. And the most likely person who has admired it and seems to have possibly had the wherewithal to steal those tires out of the parking lot is accused by the owner of this car. And so that student shows up in my office or in my associate's office, and they've got a good alibi and good story. And so we say, okay, we'll keep working on this. And then campus security uncovers some footage that clearly shows this individual stealing those tires. And so then what do you do? Grace, accountability. Does it matter that they had a chance to confess and they didn't, and instead they lied about it? One more. In every dormitory, candles, that is the real burning type of candles, are against policy for obvious reasons. So you have a student studying in the lobby, and for whatever reason, they don't need it for light, but they've got a candle burning there. Harmless enough, right? Candle falls over while the student is not there, starts a fire. And while the fire doesn't destroy the building, it does evacuate the whole dorm, and one student doesn't make it out. Period. That student is found dead, smoke inhalation. These are all parts of my world, in the student world. And because of the seriousness of the question, how do you show grace and accountability? When do you just say, this is forgiven and there's no consequences? Or when do you say, you're going to have the book thrown at you? When do you blend the two? And I've asked you to think about this, and I have not asked for hands, and I've done that intentionally because we'll come back to this. But this is really what this story is about. And I told those stories to give you some real live examples. And you can think in your own world, whether it's your children, grandchildren, siblings, employees, neighbors, there's times when you are called to show either grace or accountability or some blend of those two. And how do you do that? But then, of course, the question is, what about when it's me and I'm begging for mercy, whether it's from another person or from God? And what do I expect? And so I'm hoping that your wheels are turning as we jump into this story, because that's really what this story is all about at the end. And that we're going to see some sort of a blending of grace and accountability. We're going to see that it is indeed a blending. And I hope that we'll see something that will help us in the way that we relate to God and the way we relate to other people. So let's start with chapter 12. And Ken, you took us about to verse 13 or 14. We're going to read the first part of the chapter and go all the way to the end. And I will start with chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children and shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for him who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. I'm pausing there. That's the middle of a verse, I know. Let me just pause right there. We're going to read the rest of the story in just a minute. That's the material you covered last week. Let's just pause there. Tell me what you see so far. Just as far as we've read in the story, of course, the chapter 11, which you read a couple weeks ago in class. What do we see here about grace and accountability, about forgiveness and consequences? Which one seems to be heavier at the moment? Talk to me. Gordon?
Well, the payment that he has to make, the condemnation seems on the surface to be the strongest response.
Okay.
But he himself has been forgiven and will not be touched directly, only indirectly.
Okay.
It's almost like an example of what happens to people in this life. We do something really bad, really stupid, and we have consequences, because it's not like what we do that's off track doesn't mean anything to anybody else.
Right.
It has impacts on it. And the Lord, in most cases, doesn't have to come down and make bad things happen. They do.
Yeah. Yeah. Our stupidity causes enough bad stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you, Gordon. Somebody else. What do you see in the story so far? Grace, accountability, both, one heavier than the other? Please, Dwayne.
I find it really strange and hard to understand how it is that David could do what he did and not recognize it without having to be told by somebody else that he had made this mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. That is strange, isn't it? Weird. Yeah. Thank you.
It's an unbelievable action.
Yeah, it is.
To murder somebody because he wanted their wife.
Yeah. Yeah. It just, it blows our minds. Ken.
There was no chit chat about this when Nathan came.
Yeah.
He went directly into the case, gave the example, and there was no sitting down across the table and trying to lay out the facts and get your side of the story. It was strictly, this is what's going to happen. You're accountable. And we're going down this road right now.
Yeah.
There was no, we want to hear your side of this.
Mhm.
We already know your side of this.
Yeah, yeah. So in that way, the accountability is pretty heavy here. We're really seeing some heaviness on the accountability. Anybody else? I'm open to any other comments. What are you seeing?
Doug?
Yes, please, Roy.
In verse 10, it talks about because you have despised me. And that really struck me with the idea that even though we have the history of David, the things that we do that are against God's kingdom shows that we have not fully committed or surrendered to God. And that
Yes.
in reality, we're despising his ways.
Yep.
And that's
Yep.
got to be profound.
It is powerful. Thank you, Roy. One or two more comments, and then I'm going to go on. We're going to read the rest of the story. Anybody else?
I think God always offers us forgiveness,
Mhm.
no matter what, but he doesn't. So our eternal consequences of our sin are taken away. But he very often lets us face the consequences of what our actions put into play.
Yeah.
So the fact that his family kind of rebels against him, that there would be these consequences.
Yeah. Wow.
God does something very important. He lets David pronounce the sentence. Because
Yes.
David said that this man deserves to die. Because he had no pity. Basically, and God's saying, well, yeah, you didn't have any pity.
Yeah.
But I am going to be bigger than that, and I have pity on you because I gave you all these things, and yet I would have even given you more. I think sometimes we don't realize that God intends to give us more.
Douglas, can I ask you a
Yes.
favor, please? When somebody from the Sabbath School class speaks, can you summarize it? Because sometimes
It's not coming
we don't
through.
capture everything.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll do that, Marlene.
Thank you.
And Jana, thank you for your comment. And I'm not sure I caught everything, but let me just speak to the couple points that I really did hear that are a nice segue into where we're going. And that is that God allowed David to voice his own consequences. And notice that where David says, this man deserves to die. And that was so true. All of us would agree, David deserved to die. Now, the interesting thing is, just in passing here, is that legally, the man who took the ewe lamb did not deserve to die. Because if you take the story just at face value, while what he had done was reprehensible, legally, it was not all that bad. He had stolen a lamb. And stealing a lamb was not a crime punishable by death. It was punishable, but it was not punishable by death. Now, we're not going to go down that path too far, but this story is this little story that Nathan tells is powerful in so many ways, and we have not even come near unpacking it. But let me just land on this one point, and then we'll go on, and that is, but it catches David at a very emotional point. And notice that it goes back to his boyhood days of taking care of sheep. It's touching into some really important things, but the mere, okay, I just see that Abner is reminding me of some things here. Thank you, Abner. The mere injustice of it is really what captured David. Even though it was not a capital crime to steal that lamb, at a moral level, it got David outraged because it was so unjust. And back to your comment, Dwayne, this is where David was so blind because he had done worse, much, much worse than this. And he did deserve to die. And that's where part of the irony comes into the story. But let's take it from there. Please, John.
Just one comment real quick, just to touch on what Dwayne said. I believe that David knew exactly what he was doing, that he knew this was wrong. And he knew it was wrong because he tried to cover it up.
Yep.
And so he began to backstep and try to cover his tracks. As soon as he was confronted here, he admitted to the sin. If he hadn't admitted to the sin, David was no different than Saul, who did so many wrong things but never admitted it, always was backpedaled, never bellied up and said, I am guilty. The person who stole the tires, who you confronted, he said, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. Would your decision have been any different if he said, I blew it, I shouldn't have done it, here's why I did it, no excuses, and I'm sorry, and I'll do whatever it takes? Would your decision have been different? I don't know what it was, don't, you know, it's not the context of this class, than if he had not lied about it. And I think those consequences do absolutely make a difference because, frankly, we all in this room are going to blow it. Careful about pointing fingers too much. Because, again, we have to point them right at our own forehead and identify when we ducked and weaved, when we didn't, when we covered our tracks, versus when we didn't. And we have the courage to come forward and say, I blew it.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And let me just summarize John's comment, and then we'll come to one other here. And that is this whole idea of lying versus owning up. And David did know what he was doing, but he lied about it initially, and here he owns up to it. And that's pretty important to this whole thing. And then applying that to ourselves. When do we duck and weave when we are confronted? Please, another comment.
Doug, I think one thing that we need to say while we're looking at this, David didn't say, I sinned against Uriah. He said, I sinned against the Lord. And I think that's an important perception.
It is. Thank you. And that's, we're going to come back to that. And that is the fact that he sinned against God. Did I miss a hand over here? By the way, if you are on Zoom, I may not see you, so you may need to just unmute your mic and speak up rather than raise your hand, because I may not see your hand, but I think we have a hand here in the class. Please.
Doug, it seems like we totally are ignoring the other families because Uriah was not the only one killed as a result.
Right.
There were other families, there were other wives that didn't have husbands, other children that didn't have parents, and we just never, we blanked that out. Where do you go with that?
No, you're so right that the effect on scores and scores of people. In fact, as we spread this story out over the decades and centuries, the hundreds, if not thousands of people that are affected by this one decision. Thank you. And of course, Uriah was not the only one killed. And now what we're going to see is an attention on one other death, an innocent death, and it's the death of this little baby. We're going to go there right now. And so let's read the last part of verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. And just notice, those are the very first words out of Nathan's mouth after David confesses. Everything up until this time has been pretty strong accountability. And now, as soon as David confesses, there is a strong message of grace. The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. David has said, this man deserves to die. And then the next thing he says is, I have sinned. Nathan says to him, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Here we see the grace and the accountability back to back. But it goes deeper than that, because now the next words are back to accountability. You are not going to die, but because by doing this, you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt. The son born to you will die. Now, I want to come back to the last comment. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but the last comment about the other innocent deaths here. As you probably know, the storytelling technique in Scripture is masterful. And one of the storytelling techniques is to tell a story that starts with an idea and ends with the same idea. And then the second idea in the story is the second to the last idea in the next story. And in the same story. And the third idea is the third to the last idea. And so the ideas are parallel until you get to the middle, and the middle of the story is really the heart of what the story is all about. And it was a storytelling technique. It's called a chiastic structure. And many parts of Scripture are built on chiastic structure. This story is told in chiastic structure. I'm not going to bother you with it right now, but from the battle to the battle at the beginning to the battle at the end and so forth, the message at the beginning, the message at the end, it goes parallel. And the two parts that are parallel, interestingly enough here, is the death of innocent Uriah on the one hand, and the death of the innocent child on the other hand. Those are the two parallel parts of the story that compare with each other. And so just keep that in mind. For interest's sake, what is the peak of this chiastic structure? It is the very last verse in chapter 11. If you take each of these parallel ideas, the very peak of the chiastic structure is the last verse of chapter 11. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. That's the point of the whole story. That's the middle of this chiastic structure, and it has parallel ideas on both sides of it. And the parallel idea of Uriah's death is paralleled with the death of this little baby. So just that helps put some context here again to what you said, that this story is partly about the consequences that happen to innocent people when we do stupid, evil things. And here's another innocent person that is collateral damage from this. Let's read the story now. So verse 14 is really the crux of what we're talking about today. The point of this bigger story may be in chapter 11 and verse 27, but for our discussion today, looking at grace and accountability, what we're looking at is really embodied here in chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Grace, but because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die." Accountability. Now let's explore that a little bit further as we finish the story through the rest of the chapter. After Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and went into his house and spent the nights lying on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, we spoke to David, but he would not listen to us. How can we tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. David noticed that his servants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, "he is dead." Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request, they served him food, and he ate. His servants asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But now that the child is dead, you get up and you eat." He answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and lay with her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word to Nathan, the prophet, to name him Jedediah. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal citadel. That was incidentally the city they were fighting back at the beginning, and that's where Uriah died. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal city. Joab then sent messengers to David saying, I have fought against Rabbah and taken its water supply. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and capture it. Otherwise, I will take the city and it will be named after me. So David mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. He took the crown from the head of their king. Its weight was a talent of gold, and it was set with precious stones, and it was placed on David's head. He took a great quantity of plunder from the city and brought out the people who were there, consigning them to labor with saws and with iron picks and axes, and he made them work at brick making. He did this to all the Ammonites, to all the Ammonite towns. Then David and his entire army returned to Jerusalem. Now that's the end of the story, and this is the story that starts in chapter 11, goes through 12, and you might have already seen some of that chiastic structure, which we won't go into, but that's the story. And what I want to focus your attention on is this one idea of grace and accountability. Now that we've read the whole story of David and Bathsheba, what do you see here about grace and accountability? I want to hear a few comments, and then we're going to delve back into scripture again, looking at some background that will help us understand this and where we're going to end up today. And I better watch our time here. How are we doing on time? Yeah. Where we're going to end up is in the New Testament, in the book of Romans, where Romans quotes from this. We're going to, in the meanwhile, go to Psalm 51, which is David's prayer right after Nathan came to see him. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I do want to hear from you. You heard the story, you've seen the thing. What do you see here about grace and accountability? How is God blending grace and accountability in the way he deals with David?
Douglas,
Yes.
it's Marlene. I see that God is so balanced in everything. We see that children that are just raised with punishment, you know, that the negative consequences. Children that are raised without accountability, the big consequences. And I see this as a model of the Lord showing how we should do in our relationships. You cited examples of students' conduct. It happens with adults also working in human resources.
Yeah.
Very, very, very difficult. But you have to deal with both. I had a situation where an employee did something very wrong. And there were some people saying she should not be written up for this repetitive conduct. And so at the end, the employee was spoken and she was given grace, but a strong conversation so that hopefully in the future, by this event, that finally somebody stopped and said, no, your conduct that you are continuing to demonstrate is just leading you on a downward spiral. And so that, and it's something that we as humans, it's very difficult to confront people. We don't want to be confrontational, but having that balance is extremely important. That's my takeaway from this.
It is. Thank you. And I don't know that I need to repeat that, but this key word of balance between grace and accountability, they're both there. Thank you, Marlene. Anybody else? Now that you've seen the whole story, please, Roy.
What comes to my mind is something that Paul David Tripp clarified in his book, and that is the kingdom of costume kingdom. And one of the things that is clear here is that David took his accountability immediately when he saw it. But many times we have this costume kingdom that we create around us, thinking that we're doing good and all the other things, and we're having a good ministry or whatever, and it's for self and selfishness, not for God. And so
Yes.
we need to recognize Satan's delusion of the costume kingdom that can
Yes.
overtake us.
That's a term I hadn't heard before, but it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, somebody in the class, I think, has a comment. Gordon, this is number 2 for the day.
I know, I'm being judicious. I think it raises a really important question. We're not going to answer today, but I want to throw it out on the table for possible future discussion. And that is the issue of who is God? You know, we think of God as not doing the bad things. We think of God as being just and exerting vengeance. The Bible's full of both all the time.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think there's a text that says that God doesn't do any of the bad things, implying maybe that he withdraws his spirit. And
Yep. Yep.
I'm just throwing that out as a.
And Gordon, it's a good comment, because I know that the verse that says here in verse 15, 12, 15, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had born to David, taken in isolation, all by itself, apart from the bigger story. That can really trouble us. And many people are troubled by that. And we're not going to go down that path too far, but I hope that by our larger conversation, we at least have some context to look at a problem text like that with clearer eyes. I'm going to go forward unless I missed a comment. Was there somebody's comment I missed? Okay, let me take us forward a little bit. I told you that we were going to go to Psalm 51. Let's do that right now. Go to Psalm 51 right now. And as you've heard me say in the past, the Psalms are not all written by David, but about a third of them are clearly attributed to David. And of those third that are attributed to David, some of them tell us specifically, I think it's about 18 of them, tell us specifically what was going on in David's life when he wrote this. And we've already gone to some of those Psalms. We've seen some from his days of running from Saul, and it tells us exactly where he was and what he was doing. And we've tied those stories together with that Psalm. Here's another one like that. Psalm 51 has this heading, which is part of the original text. And it says, for the director of music, a Psalm of David, when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. I mean, that's pretty clear. This locates this Psalm. And whether he wrote it 5 minutes later or 5 days later or a few weeks later, this was during the time. Maybe it was those 7 days when he was fasting and praying. Maybe, I don't know. But it was shortly after Nathan left. And I want you to see just the first part of this. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. Blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before you, or before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak, and justified when you judge. I want to just land on this for just a second. That last phrase in verse 4, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. In preparing for this lesson, I read that from a dozen or more different translations. And some of the translations make it so clear that in case you miss it in the NIV, here's some of the other translations. It says, when you hold me accountable, when you tell me the consequences for my actions, that's being judged. And notice what David is saying at the very time that he's pleading for God's mercy. He also says in verse 4, he says, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge or when you hold me accountable. Catch what David is saying here in this great psalm of repentance. He's at the same time pleading for mercy and acknowledging that he has culpability. And John, back to your comment, he's no longer dodging and weaving. He is not trying to make any excuses. He said, God, you know it all. And when you lay it out before me and you see what nobody else can see in totality, you see the whole thing. You saw from the moment I lusted after Bathsheba, when I watched her bathe, right on through to when I heard that she was pregnant, until I got the news that Uriah was dead, and I covered it up for a year. You know what was going on inside of me and all these grieving families. Lord, it was all open before you, and I deserve to die. And if you state your judgment about me and what I deserve, nobody can argue with you, because you see it all and you are justified when you judge. Just let that sink in. We oftentimes read this psalm and hear it as a beautiful cry for mercy and a rejoicing in that mercy that he found. But in the middle of it, he acknowledges that there are consequences to our behavior and that God is not in the wrong to do them. God is not in the wrong to hold us accountable. So notice that verse, and then let's just read a bit farther. Hold off just a second, Gordon. I'll come back to you for your third and last comment of the day. So read verse 4 and then just keep reading. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are proved right when you speak and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Surely you desire truth in the inward parts. You teach me wisdom in the inmost place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will turn back to you. Save me from blood guilt, O God, the God who saves me, and my tongue will sing your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise, and so forth. So I'm going to come to Gordon's comment in just a second, but I want you to notice that David knows he's forgiven, and he's receiving that with joy. He's acknowledging that God is accepting and embracing him. He's in God's presence again. That's clear. He is not wallowing in uncertainty. And at that same time, he is saying, and I know that there are consequences of this. The consequences is not eternal separation from you. The consequence is not losing your presence, but there are consequences. And little did he know how horrible those consequences would be. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but let's go to Gordon.
Well, it just struck me that he didn't really come to this point until after his son died.
Yeah.
So he experienced the forgiveness of God.
Mm-hmm.
But you might think, well, maybe that experience of forgiveness, which we can do ourselves to each other, requires also the experience of some of the consequences in order for us to really appreciate what that forgiveness means.
Yeah. And you know, Gordon, I think that I would say that based on what you just said, and I think that's a very insightful comment, he probably wrote this after the death of that little baby.
Yeah.
This was probably not written during that 7 days when he was fasting and praying. It was probably written afterwards. Yeah, you're right. Any other comments? We're gonna move on fairly rapidly here. Clear in the back, there's a comment. Please, I see a hand in the back.
Well, I'm just thinking that maybe it's a mercy that the child would die for himself, because he would always have that stigma about his life, what happened.
Yeah. Linda, so good to see you. I have missed you, and I'm glad to see you and to hear your comment. And Linda's comment is maybe it was a mercy that this child died. And I don't want to go down that path too far, because I know, again, it involves a lot of questions, but I think it's possible. Just stop and think about this. If you think about the innocent deaths, and if this is paralleling Uriah's death, this child had a lot against it already. And so, yes, there might have been something that if that child had lived, would have been a fate worse than death. Ken, you had a comment.
It's John.
Oh, John.
Yeah, I don't want to go, we've talked about the natural consequences. You're forgiven, but yes, there are natural consequences. But it was mentioned quite a while ago in this class that verse 14 addresses the effects that our judgment decisions could have on a lot of other people. It captures the universe we're dealing with. And so what would have happened if there were no consequences to David's actions?
Yep.
What would it said to God's enemies? What would it said to others? That this is okay. You know, it's not that bad. It's all right. I mean, you could steal tires on campus. You know, I don't want you to do it, but I guess it's okay to do it at Walla Walla. And so, you know, again, the forgiveness is not necessarily, well, it is the issue. I mean, we have to understand that. But as we in our communities oftentimes do pass judgments. I mean, the question I ask myself is, what happens if I do nothing? What happens if I do not hold this individual accountable? What happens if Marlene doesn't hold that individual accountable? What does it do for the environment we are in here? And who is the victor? And oftentimes when you ask that question, forgiveness is certainly in order. The consequences and how it impacts our community has to be at the center, at least of a leader's life, as they pass those judgments.
Yep. Very true. Thank you. Did I miss any other comments? So John's comment, consequences have to be a part of what holds a community together, because if God had done nothing, think about what that would have said about what is okay and not in that community.
If I could just add one more thing to it. So if someone comes up to David and says, well, you did this, why can't I do that? And David can say, yeah, God took my son. Now, you know, do you want that to happen to you? I don't want it to happen to you. At least you have that leverage. You know, we have that. I believe that to be quite important.
And if there weren't consequences to David, there would have been consequences regardless.
Yep. Yep.
That's right.
On one side or the other, there are going to be consequences.
There's going to be consequences. And I think that the question that often comes, well, are those consequences natural consequences?
That's right.
Or are they imposed consequences? And again, I'm not going to go down that path too far, but I think it's a reasonable question, and it's probably a combination of both. But what I want to do is, we've only got about 15 minutes left. I want to take us to a couple of background passages and then move forward to the New Testament, because I want us to see how this fits into the larger picture of what was going on for Israel, for David, and for us. And that's really where we're going in the last bit of this, as we apply this to say, how do we understand the balance? And Marlene, you said it so well, in consequences and grace. And sometimes we show more of one, more of the other. How do we understand that? And I think there's some things here that can give us some clues. And I'm going to give you some scripture references, which I won't have time to read, but I hope to read a few of them that are particularly pointed. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. And this, of course, is Moses speaking to the children of Israel just before they go into the promised land, centuries before they had the first king, but Moses anticipating that someday they would want a king and what things would look like. And here in Deuteronomy 17 and verse 14, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner above you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so they may learn to revere the Lord as God and follow carefully all the words of his law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over the kingdom in Israel. Now, the king was never God's intention, but God says, if you're going to have a king, let's do this the best way possible. And this is an interesting passage to study. There's several others like it, but let's just notice this, that the king is not to think that he's better than the others. He's not to take privileges that the others can't take. Instead, he has responsibilities that they don't have. One of those responsibilities is to handwrite a copy of God's word. And it was God's word up until that point, which was what we know as the first 5 books of Moses. That was what was in writing. And he's to write it out with his own hand. And then every day he is to be reflecting on that personally. Now think if David had been reading that afternoon when he couldn't sleep from some of these passages instead of letting his eyes wander onto the rooftops. Then maybe the story would have ended differently, and so forth. You get the idea. Think about the commandments that he's specifically to be reflecting on here. David breaks at least 3 of them. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill. What if he'd been reflecting on those and saying, oh God, make that internal for me. I don't want to be somebody who abuses his power and uses his position in a way that is contemptuous of people and of you. If David had been doing that. So that's just a thought. I want you to think about that. Then I want you to fast forward and I want you to see 2 Samuel chapter 7. We looked at this a little while ago, but notice that this passage ended by saying that when a king acts this way, he'll reign for a long time. So go to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and we looked at this a while back, and this is where David offers to build the temple for the ark and for God. And God says, thanks, but no thanks. And here you remember, he says, no, you're not going to build a house for me, but I'm going to build a house for you. And here in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and starting with verse 12, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men and floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before me. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now, there's a lot packed into this, and I only have time to give it in summary form. So listen carefully, because I'm going to say a lot in just a few words here. What we see in the story of 1 and 2 Samuel is the rise and fall of Saul and the rise and fall of David. The stories of David and Saul were probably put in their written form as we have them many, many years later, after the monarchy had fallen and after people were captive in Babylon, and they were asking themselves the question, what went wrong? Why did this monarchy thing go off the rails so much? And the stories of Saul's rise and fall and David's rise and fall help explain that and help the people understand what God was doing on the bigger picture. We also see the individual and we see the personal lessons, but we see the national level. Now, with Saul's sin, the throne was taken away from him and given to somebody else. Didn't stay in the family. With David's sin, it's almost worse. Because instead of the throne being taken away, it's left in the family, and the family drives it into the ground. It's almost like the difference between a business that somebody loses ownership of and a business that stays in the family for a long time, but that family just drives it further and further into the ground. But it gets worse than that because they are abusing people in the process. They are hurting people right, left, and center as they drive that business into the ground. And by and large, David's family so terribly abused their power that it eventually ends in the whole nation being laid waste because David's family had driven the country into the ground and away from God. And so the fact that they stayed in power so long, so many centuries, ended up being in some ways more of a curse than a blessing. Now, there's many layers to this, and I'm not going down that path too far. But here's what I want you to see, is that the turning point was Bathsheba. That's where it turns. And oddly enough, the person who specifically starts that is Solomon, Bathsheba's son. Because even though Solomon is a good king in many ways, and he takes the kingdom to its golden age, he also starts the beginning of the split of the kingdom into north and south. And eventually the south goes so far against God that they drop off the map and leaving only, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. The northern kingdom drops off the map, leaving only in the southern kingdom where Jerusalem is. And eventually then they do too. It's an ugly, sordid, violent history that hinges on the Bathsheba incident and comes to its head with Bathsheba's son Solomon, but then drags on and on and on like a chronic illness that just keeps taking the nation down bit by bit until finally, several hundred years later, it ends in the bloodbath of Nebuchadnezzar coming and just wiping the city out and taking the people captive. And in captivity, during their 70-year captivity, they're saying, what in the world went wrong? And God says, I'll show you what went wrong. Here's the story of Saul's rise and fall. Here's the story of David's rise and fall. And right now it's just this slow motion film of this free fall of horrible, horrible consequences that came from that. Now, the rest of our study of David is pretty much going to be the consequences from this event. But we will not study the next hundreds of years that go on where it gets worse than that even. Yes, there are bright spots. Certainly there's beautiful bright spots along the way, but the trajectory is down. Now, we are getting very close to the end of our time. Let me take you to the New Testament, because I want you to see this idea of grace and accountability tied together. And I want you to go to the book of Romans. Go to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. And I want you to see here the quotation that Paul pulls from Psalm 51. And it was that verse 4 that I ask you to pay special attention to. In the middle of this long discussion about how Jesus forgives us and how Jesus sets us right from sin, and that there's nothing we can do to save ourselves, he drops in this verse from Psalm 51 and makes a particular point with it. And it's verse 4 about accountability. And I want you to see how all this fits together. Romans chapter 3 and verse 3. Romans 3, verse 3. What if some did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every man a liar, as it is written. And now he quotes from Psalm 51, verse 4. So that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Now just stop and think about that. And I know that you're not probably thinking at the moment of the context of Romans 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But let me briefly give you the context. Paul starts off with the good news, bad news sort of a way here. He said, I want to tell you about the good news. Jesus has saved us, and there's nothing we can do to save ourselves. But before you are ready for the good news, you got to hear the bad news. And the bad news is you can't save yourself and you're hopeless. And until you accept that bad news, you're not ready for the good news. And to see a little bit of that bad news, and I don't have time to give you the whole context here, but just drop on down to verse 9 of chapter 3. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made a charge that Jews and Gentiles are alike, all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands God. No one even seeks him. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their paths, and the ways of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. All of those, by the way, from verses 10 to 18, are quotations from the Psalms and a couple from Isaiah. And you notice that most of those describe David during 1 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. Just an interesting coincidence. And then when Paul has thoroughly painted us in the worst possible light and said, this is everybody, including David. This is everybody. Everybody needs God's grace. And when God judges us, he is exactly where he should be, because his assessment of us is accurate. And don't you try to wiggle out of that. Once we face that bad news, then we're ready for the good news. And of course, Paul will go on to say that in the rest of his book, but let me just read this little bit here. He says in verse 19, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his own sight by observing the law. Rather, the law makes us conscious of sin. But now a righteousness from God, apart from law, has been made known, which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness from God, this righteousness comes from God through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by the grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. Grace and accountability live together. God holds us accountable and he offers us grace all at the same time. And Paul makes his point so clear, and he quotes from Psalm 51, and he gives fairly indirect reference to David's sin and says, and this is how God shows grace. Well, folks, we are just about at the end of our time, and I am sorry that we don't have longer to milk the richness out of this, because it's pretty powerful. But I come back to where I started. When I have that impassioned, angry person on the phone who's saying, these students need to be punished as far as possible, starting with expulsion and ending with execution. And I have the youth pastor writing and saying, this is the dearest, sweetest person. They always led song service, helped in Pathfinders. And I've got people calling for grace, and I've got people calling for justice. And how do I, as a person, have the wisdom of God to know how to pull together grace and accountability? When I am crying out to God, and I say, God, please give me your grace, and I know that you're going to hold me accountable too. What do I expect from God? Folks, I'm sorry that we have to end with that, but Ken, I want to give you a little bit of time to wrap up, as you always do.
Well, wow. Isn't it amazing how people can be blessed from a small hotel room somewhere in Northern California? It's amazing, really. It really is. What a lesson. So, how do we apply this? I'm not going to kill anybody for their wife. I'm not going to steal anybody's tires. I promise you that. So how does this apply to me? I'll tell you how. Got a perfect example. When did the tornado come? April through here? Ripped my place apart. trees that were 100 years old were gone. They're laying on the ground. So I started cleaning up before I called my insurance company. Great insurance, non-sell, State Farm, best guy walking. I called and I said, I got all kind of problems. I got trees everywhere. I can't get down my driveway. Can't even see my house from the road. He said, well, I'm sorry, Ken, you don't have any coverage. I said, no coverage. I said, this is a war zone. He said, you have no coverage for anybody in the United States with an insurance company for trees. Really? I've already spent $30,000. We're just getting started. So I'm sorry. So I said, well, I know how to play this game. I can be a master at this. So I almost pick up the phone and call my general contractor, one of my general contractors. It's very close to. I'm about to ask him to bring his subcontractors over, his plumbers, his carpenters, his roofers, his everybody else, his blown up drivers. Let's start looking at any damage we have. I want you to get a price, and I want you to triple it. I want you to quadruple it. I want you to pad every invoice you got. I want to turn it into State Farm, the things that they do cover, and I'll show you how to play this game. And so I sleep on it. And so here I am. I am David. I want something, and I know how to get it. I will bring Joe out in, a general contractor. I will make him complicit in these crimes, and I will get what I want. And then the small voices start talking to you and say, Ken, why would you do that? Why would you lie and bring other people into all that? When God has been so good to you. You'll find it. So that's why it hit home to me today. That's how it hits home. When I say Doug is a master teacher, I think you understand when I say that. I don't say that about, maybe Jerry Arnold was a master teacher. I only know two right now. John is a tremendous teacher. He also has a class on Thursday night about transition. He's teaching people that are going through transition.
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you. Doug, thank you again. Thank you, everybody that tuned in. Thank you, everybody in the room that came. John will be teaching next week, and we will be into the second tragedy. And it is hard to believe that this could happen to a family. So stay tuned. And with that, John, I want to do that one first.
Father, thank you for this message. Help us understand the challenges that David went through. Help us learn what we've heard today. Help us learn from our mistakes. Help us have courage to confront those mistakes. And help us understand that makes us stronger in your name. Father, as we leave here, help us understand how to better walk our path and lead our lives through you. I ask